safety in batteries is a really critical topic. There have been some notable safety incidents. Luckily, most of these facilities are not staffed usually, so you have that little safer in that you don't have people there at the facility often. But you have to have a certain distance between the containers. You have to have usually clusters of containers have to have roadways between them. And that's both for safety purposes and for if you, let's say, had a transformer go out, you'd have to, bring in a crane. And so, there needs to be a certain working distance. That
Space, yeah.
varies a little bit from supplier to supplier, but everyone has some requirements for roadways on the project site.
What about noise considerations? This is a very elementary question, but in land, oftentimes footprint and workspace and things like that are accountable or functions of making sure you've got enough room for noise suppression when you're in, say, highly domesticated areas, closer to cities, residential areas. Are there any? What's the consideration there for a battery storage project?
Yeah, there are a lot of noise considerations. It varies from market to market. You have certain markets where, first of all, if the facilities are being built, way out in the countryside in the middle of cornfields, it's usually less of a concern. And some markets have stricter rules than others. For example, I'm working on a project now in Ontario, Canada, and they have very strict requirements to the point where I can't remember the exact decibel level, but it's like I looked up the equivalent. It was like the sound level you'd find in a quiet library is what they
Oh my,
require, only about 100 feet away. So the component that generates the most noise on the battery system is typically the inverter, and that's mainly driven by the cooling fans that are inside of the inverter. Sean mentioned now some battery products are bringing the inverter right into the battery container, so usually that can cut the noise down a little bit. But on projects like the one in Ontario or any market where noise is a key concern, especially as you mentioned, Brent, if you're like next to a residential area, that's really important. A lot of noise modeling has to be done. So you'll get a noise model for the individual inverter or battery, and then that will contribute to a noise study that will determine how many decibels are going to be experienced at a certain level. And in general, the goal is to shoot the sound up, so try to get your noise to go straight up rather than out, because that'll just reduce the amount of noise that the neighbors or whoever ends up hearing.
And I haven't seen this in the US yet, but in Australia, we've actually had a project or two where there were very strict noise requirements, and we had to build a sound wall to block the noise, which can add a couple million to a big project, but
it could be
definitely a concern.
Well, we see that, the reason I asked about noise is just space, right? Footprint of your land acquisition efforts. If you have a 10-acre project, but you can find 20 acres that's suitable, it's much cheaper to buy potentially 10 additional acres or 20 additional acres in some instances than to have to build a $2 million wall, right? Noise suppression and things like that. So those are all considerations, things we deal with in land capture for oil and gas, a number of different energy projects that we do, all considerations and that affect how big of a footprint you might need. And I think that kind of leads us to the next thing we want to maybe progress into is just talking about the location of the projects. Do you locate them closer to substations, as Drew mentioned earlier, or do you get them into more of the load centers, around larger cities and things? What do you see? I think, are there different companies that target different types of battery storage projects? What's the story there?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's trying to get land next to
Everywhere.
substations. Right, that can be out remote away from the cities. It can be closer to the load centers, but you do want to be as close as possible as that substation, because that substation is your network, that everything else around you. The more lines coming in and out of that substation, the more potential to, either charge your project or discharge. If you're not next to the substation, right, maybe you're between substations, what you want to do is build a line tap where you're right on the transmission line, again, as close as possible. so that your gen tie, the way you connect to the transmission line, is as short as possible. Right. Um, the further you are from the substation, the more line you have, the more potential for failure. And right, if for a line tap, you basically have two ways to get, out to the two connecting substations. So if one goes down, you're left with one line. If your actual gen tie goes down, the longer that is, right, the more potential for it to fail. Then you're out until it can be fixed. But yeah, you really want to be next to the substations. The more they're connected, the more opportunities to move electricity, right? And hopefully there's less congestion and costs, right? The longer your gen tie, the higher your costs are. So yeah, everyone's fighting to buy up land right next to substations where there's still open bays or room for expansion, room for more bays to be built so they can just tap right in. Of course, you got to look at, well, what other projects are around? How congested is that substation? Is there actually headroom to put more transmission on there? Are there planned upgrades so there will be more headroom? Those are all things to consider from the technical side of moving electricity.